So tonight I'm going to be in a four-part series on religious fundamentalism. So tonight we're going to start with an analysis of fundamentalism in general, and that'll take a bit of time. And then I'm going to look in the second part of the class at some examples of Jewish fundamentalism. This will be followed in successive weeks by fundamentalism in Protestant Christianity, then Islam, and Hinduism. So it's a 4-week class. So the main purpose of the class is to demonstrate the growth of a certain category of religious thinking that is taking place in various degrees within all the major religious traditions. We're finding in all the religious traditions a large number of people going back to what we call fundamentalist thinking. I personally find that a bit problematic because fundamentalist thinking tends to separate. But it's probably, well, it's not probably, it's a reaction to modernity. It's the reaction to the sudden change that's taking place. And by sudden change, I'm talking about, let's say, the last century. If you look at even when the time that I was born, if I look at all the changes, but think of, if you go back to 1900, all the changes that have taken place. And I think it's a generally valid statement to say that people don't like a lot of change quickly. It bothers the psyche. It makes things seem disoriented. And fundamentalism is one way of trying to deal with that. So, in any case, so let us begin with what I've called the 6 characteristics of fundamentalism. And these have been derived, I didn't make them up. These were derived from a very comprehensive study done in the 1990s, carried out by the University of Chicago under the name of the Fundamentalism Project in 3 volumes. You can see those there. And so what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is go over what they say are the 6 general characteristics of fundamentalist movements. Not all the movements have all 6 characteristics, but these are 6 characteristics that tend to allow you to label something fundamentalist. So, here's a list of them. Can you read those? Okay, they're kind of small here, but I'll be going over them, and I think I have them on your outline, right? Okay. So, perhaps the most striking feature of fundamentalist thinking is the phenomena of seeing one's own community or tradition as the sole repository of religious truth. We have the truth. You don't. That's one of the main characteristics. Here the group or the tribe is envisioned as having a special and superior relationship with God. We have a superior relationship. This is reflected in such notions as the chosen people, community of the saved, community of the saints, the twice born. Many of these groups will have special names which isolate them as being different, which in turn then creates the idea of the other. Okay? There's our group and there's the other, who are seen as being of less value than those who are chosen. There are the chosen and there are the others. What Martin Buber, the famous Jewish theologian, referred to as an I-it relationship rather than an I-thou relationship. When you have an I-it relationship, other people become its, not thous. They become objects. An I-thou relationship is believed to be a more mature relationship because I recognize your thou and you recognize my thou. I don't treat you just as a number or an object. I treat you as a person. There's a tendency in many fundamentalist groups only to treat, well, they do treat each other as person, but only within the group. Outside, it tends to be different. So that's the first one. The first one actually leads into the second, and that's called demonization of the opposition. Demonization of the opposition. Here we find what might be termed satanic labeling. Okay? Satanic labeling, whereby the other is not just seen as different, we're all different, but actively portrayed as malevolent. Not just different, everyone's different, but different categorically and malevolent. So historically, a classic example has been labeling the Jews as the Lord's killer. Okay? Or even worse, to use the terms of Martin Luther, the devil's feces. Such thinking embraces what we call Manichaean dualism, whereby the world is depicted as a battleground between two opposing forces. This usually takes on the form of some sort of cosmic struggle between good and evil. And who's good? We are. Who's evil? The others are. In terms of light and darkness, in relation to which historical events are then interpreted. And we'll see this in all the religions have this. I'm not pointing to one religion. All religions have these elements within them. By its very nature, this style of thinking is confrontational. There has to be an enemy, and it is our duty to oppose this enemy with all the forces at our disposal. Third characteristic is what we call a literalist and or inerrantist approach to Scripture and tradition. A literal interpretation of text takes the approach that words have exact and objective meanings that can be universally understood, reflected in the idea that the text speaks for itself. Consequently, there's often a lack of appreciation of the metaphorical nature of much of the material. Where the approach really falls down, in my estimation, is that it fails both to understand the nature of language and also it's never practiced consistently. Words, by their very nature, are not the objects or ideas they represent. The word dog is not a dog. It's a symbol. It's a sound or a written word that we use to point to something, the dog. But there's always a difference. Words and the objects they represent, there's always a gap. That's just how language is. Language isn't the thing that you're talking about. It represents or it symbolizes what you're talking about. So there's always this gap between symbol and object. By definition, therefore, texts demand interpretation. Every text demands interpretation. There is no inherent universal objective meaning in any text. And therefore, there's often a lack of understanding in terms of understanding what the text is trying to say. Now, there usually is some sort of cultural consensus as to what certain words mean. So as we're walking around and I say something, you don't stop me and say, well, could you please explain dog to me? Okay, there's a general understanding. But there's often a result is what you're saying and what I'm hearing are two different things. Because when you think of a dog, you think of a Great Dane. And when I think of a dog, I think of a poodle. Okay? And unless there's some way of determining that between us with further language. The other thing is, even though there is consensus in a group often about language, we know historically that changes. Meanings of words change over time. The word virtuous, which we often use, and is tended historically to be referred to as women being very virtuous, in Latin meant very strong. It was a martial. If you were virtuous, you were a great warrior. So even the meanings of words change over time. And so varying views exist. That's just historical reality. And this is why, in any religious group, Scripture needs somebody who interprets it. Who interprets it in the Catholic Church? The Catholic hierarchy. Not just the Pope himself, but you have a whole hierarchy that interprets it. Or any group. You may be open it up a bit to what it may mean, but somewhere along the line, someone says, this is the parameter. You can't believe that such and such is racism. You can't believe Jesus was a racist, I don't think, if you are a Methodist. There are those who do believe that Jesus was a racist, and it's called Christian nationalism, and it's on the rise. But in any case, so there always has to be somebody who interprets it. Texts, by definition, have to be interpreted. I could prove that to you very easily. I could give you all a copy of just about anything, ask you all to read it, and ask you all to write down the meaning. Anybody, any gamblers in here? How many think everyone would say the same thing? No. You'd have different interpretations. Actually, the Catholic Church warned Martin Luther about this when he said sola scriptura. Because they said, well, who's going to interpret that? Every individual? So, there's a tendency in fundamentalist groups to not see this as a problem. Someone will tell you what the meaning is, and that's the meaning. So and it's usually literal. But like I said, even when literalism is accepted, it's rarely consistent. How many Christians take Luke 3:16 literally? Jesus will baptize with fire. Literally. Yeah. We would say, no, it's metaphorically. He will baptize with fire, meaning something not just literal fire. So there's any text, people will choose to leave certain things out that they don't look right. Okay, more substantial linguistically, so that's literalism, is inerrancy. Inerrancy proclaims revelation as the only source of truth. The religious text is the only source of truth. All knowledge is contained therein, and anything within Scripture cannot be wrong. That means inerrant. There can be nothing in Scripture that is wrong, literally. It still has its linguistic and philosophical problems. It does allow for metaphorical interpretation, but it really becomes problematic in terms of historical and scientific truth. So for an inerrantist in their text, if something is there and then we find a historical event that counters that, what will they say? The historical event is not right in some way. It's either been spun or that you don't have accurate sources. Yeah. Also with science. If there's something in the text that disagrees with science, then what has to be wrong? Science. If you interpret the text as saying that the earth was created in 6 days, and science tells you no, if you're in one of these fundamentalist groups, you will accept the text. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we talk about evolution next week. So, thus, if findings of history or science don't agree with the text, they should be rejected out of hand. The classic example is being evolution, but this isn't just a Christian. There are fundamentalist Muslims who reject evolution. There are fundamentalist Hindus who reject evolution. And I want to make that clear right from the get-go. We're talking about these characteristics can be found in every religious tradition. Doesn't mean everybody that's part of the religious tradition is fundamentalist. I'm not saying that. But if you take the spectrum, you will find fundamentalist groups, and we categorize them by these characteristics. So a fourth feature that's directly related to both literalism and inerrancy is that of subjective selectivity. involved in determining what parts of Scripture and the tradition are to be stressed. In fundamentalist groups, the tradition is rarely dealt with as a whole, either in time, that's historically, to see what's gone on historically, or space, range of cultural interpretations. Rather, interpretations come to be used in terms of specific social and political agendas. Selectivity does two things, of this nature anyway. It's what we call, it decontextualizes the tradition. It takes the tradition out of context. It doesn't see it as a developing process. The truth was then and will always be then. The fifth characteristic is fundamentalism looks back at what they call the golden age, or the purity of tradition. When things were, if not perfect, then certainly superior to the present, thus contrasting them with what is known as the decadence of modernity. Here we find a general suspicion of change or innovation. The truth is to be found in the past, not in the present. And it's the group's responsibility to reclaim or recreate that past. In the contemporary United States, this is manifest in the evangelical call to reclaim our country, which has fallen into the grips of Satan. It is a position that is reactive in nature and focuses hostility on three main sources. One, the established religion. Fundamentalist groups are the smaller, generally break-off groups, and we'll really go into this in Christianity and how this developed historically next week. Fundamentalist groups tend to be against the established denominations. They're also against the secular state and pluralistic civil society. These three are seen as potential enemies. This is what Martin Marty, who was one of the editors of this fundamentalism project, said. Fundamentalists, then, can be said to share this family resemblance. So all fundamentalist groups do these. Across the board, they identify three antagonists: the tepid or corrupt religious establishment, mainstream denominations; the secular state, the government; and secularized society as objects of sustained opposition to true believers. Established religion has not protected them from the evils of the world. This is the fundamentalist approach. Indeed, it has compromised with them. That's the view. Established religion has compromised with the evils of the world. The secularizing state, with its rationalizing bureaucracy, has penetrated all spheres of life by introducing secular education and prohibiting religious practices in schools, permitting or encouraging sinful practices such as divorce. We forget that one. Extramarital sex, abortion, and homosexuality. You'll find all, if you look at fundamentalist groups across the board, you look at those activities. Similarly, the civil society is viewed as a threat by the fundamentalists to all these religious traditions, their religious tradition. Among forces working to alienate the faithful, and particularly the young, from their religious beliefs and affiliation: the corrupting media, TV, cinema, secular literature, secular volunteer associations, and foreign influences. Perhaps paradoxically, many fundamentalist groups see the past as being reclaimed through a future end-of-time event, whereby God will lead the way to purification. And these, what we call eschatologies, are not just part of an abstract mythology. They have definite political manifestations as well. Do you remember in the year 2000 how there were a number of Christian groups going to the Holy Land because this was the end? And this, what we call Golden Age syndrome, produces a tendency towards puritanical behavior requirements, both ritually and ethically. Elaborate requirements create a powerful, effective dimension, which are usually imitative and conforming in nature. They are generally distinctive. In these groups, you'll find distinctive music, prayer methods, chants, often distinct rules of dress, lists of sinful behavior in detail, rules about eating, drinking, sex, appropriate speech, and the discipline of children. You'll find these. And as we go through the various groups, I think you'll see these. Likewise, there's often censorship of reading material and close supervision of listening and viewing practices. Puritanism of this type tends to put religion at odds with social and historical change. It curbs creative responses, or to use theological language, it chains up the hands of God. God can't change. Things can't change. The past was golden. The past was best. That's where we've gone wrong. We have left the golden age. And then finally, 6, fundamentalism is often characterized by charismatic authoritarian leadership. Here we find both beliefs and life choices controlled from above, the leader. Independent critical evaluation is discouraged, if not forbidden. A fundamentalist approach claims that the bridge of knowledge has already been constructed, and its architect is usually a leading light within the community. This surrender of self generally requires a type of father figure who often manipulates and somehow, by doing so, will make the world safe. It generally involves giving over to the leader or leaders the existential difficulty of making choices. You don't have to choose. I'll choose for you, because I know. If you've ever seen, and we often refer to these as cult leaders, there's sort of the ability to mesmerize the people. Can you think of any fairly recent cults? Jim Jones, yeah. Koresh, with yes, yeah. The group in San Diego that saw the comet. Yeah. Again, you find these in all religions. They're not necessarily large in number, but they're growing. In all religions, they're growing. Okay, let me conclude this section before we actually get to some examples in Judaism by reflecting on what I term fundamentalist states of mind. What are the states of mind that allow for this type of development? If we look beneath the phenomena of the views and behaviors, we find certain states of mind that psychologically support them. And I would suggest that we all share these in varying degrees. We all share these that I'm going to mention. And so I would hope that as I discuss these, you'd only think of them in terms of fundamentalism, but perhaps your own views of the world. Because I don't want to just say they're fundamentalists and there's us, as if there's nothing shared. I think there are states of mind that are shared. The first is fear. Yep. Human beings have a natural tendency to fear change, especially when it comes to questions regarding their identity or their meaning systems. When your identity or your meaning system is challenged, that creates fear. Systems or modes of behavior that are different from our own, more often than not, bring with them feelings of anxiety. If you ever traveled into a different culture and spent some time there, and you begin to realize everyone doesn't look at the world the same way. And that creates a bit of a culture shock, we call it, and a bit of anxiety and fear. One way of responding to this type of anxiety is to harden one's own views. It's a protective device. We might call it the circling the wagons mentality. This approach gives us a certain psychological comfort zone, makes us feel we, that's our group, have the answers to life's problems. Thus, views that challenge our own are often labeled as inherently wrong or incorrect, and rather than positing that there may be other perspectives that have something valuable to say about reality, there's often a tendency to just completely shut down, especially in times of rapid change, such as our own, where a restricted vision becomes for many a way of retaining their sense of groundedness. Otherwise, the world looks pretty chaotic. All these different views. Who's right? Is there truth? Have you ever experienced that sense of floating anxiety? How do I know? That's one of the, so fear. Second is what I've labeled as hubris. What's hubris in Greek? Pride. Or arrogance. Pride or arrogance. If fear is the mother of fundamentalism, or mother-father of fundamentalism, then hubris is the aunt and uncle. There appears to be a natural human tendency to want to wield power over others. There were some wonderful studies done at Stanford years ago, where a group of young students were put into situations where one group was given control over the other, and over time allowed to do whatever they wanted to that other group. And these weren't down and out, these were normal, if Stanford students are normal. And many of them got violent, many of them took advantage of that power, which may tell us something about ourselves. Don't we like a little power over other people sometimes? Isn't it nice? Don't we see that on the sporting field when we knock the guy down and go, yeah, that sense of power. So this is something we all tend to share, if we're honest, to a certain degree. But there's a reason why in Greek tragedy, if you ever read any Greek tragedy, hubris is always the cause of the fall. Overextending yourself, pride, arrogance. When you're that proud or arrogant, often in Greek tragedy, you're about to take the big dip. Then there's the third, and I didn't put it on there, but you can add it, is ignorance. And all that I mean by that is the lack of knowledge about one's own tradition, not to mention others. You just don't know. You haven't taken the time to do a little research. If you went out to buy a car, would you go to the first lot and the first salesman offered you something, would you automatically buy it? You might do a little research. Okay? So this is the notion. Many of these, they have no understanding of their own. This is one of the reasons Albert and I do these classes, to see even Christianity has a historical context. So not knowledge, a type of ignorance. And I don't like to say that as, well, I know and you don't. I'm not putting it that way. It's just that we're lazy. We tend to be lazy. We tend often to want somebody else to tell us. Go quickly to the internet, find the first answer. Okay. So there's these, and I suggest we all have these to some degree. And then finally, and this might sound strange, there's love. Oh, wait a moment. Love is one of the most noble of human emotions. I can hear you saying it right now. That may be, but isn't there a reason behind the saying, love is blind? Did that just come out of nowhere? And here I'm not just referring to individual relationships, but the love of one's tribe, one's tradition, one's religion, which when not put under the harness of both reason and compassion, can produce and has produced very irrational, destructive behavior. Why do you think most murders take place by someone who claimed to love the person before that? Why do they always look at the husband first in murder cases? Because the statistics show that when you have deep emotional attachment one way, and things don't go your way. Okay, so having said all that, let's now take a look at some fundamentalist examples in Judaism. And as I go through these various traditions, try and keep in mind these characters. See if one of these characteristics pop up along the way. So, two main trends in Judaism that can be and have been characterized as fundamentalist are one, militant religious Zionism, and two, what is known as ultra-orthodoxy or strict orthodoxy. The group that is known as the Haredim, and we'll begin with those. Haredi, it's called, Haredi Judaism. It's a term used to describe the most conservative form of Orthodox Judaism. Generally referred to outsiders as ultra-Orthodox. Jewish community has orthodoxy, it has reform, and it has ultra-Orthodoxy and conservative. So if you look at the Jewish community as a whole, there's usually these four different elements. Ultra-Orthodoxy is on the far end, okay? On the far end. They consider their belief system and religious practices to extend in an unbroken chain back to Moses and his receiving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. Their chain of tradition is the one that accurately goes back to Moses. As a result, they regard non-Orthodox and even an extent modern Orthodox streams of Judaism to be deviations from the authentic and pure Judaism. Ringing some bells? They especially reject what they call Jewish secularism. Do any of you have any Jewish friends who would consider themselves Jewish secularists? Many modern Jews are either Reform or consider themselves secularists. They belong to the tradition, but all the rules, which we'll get to in a moment. But the Haredi see these as not pure, and they see that this movement developed amongst European Jews in the 18th and 19th century, and that's true. There was a group of Jews in Germany, in France, largely in Germany, who believed they needed to accept Enlightenment values, to seek better integration into European society, get out of the ghetto, and support secular education. Haredi Judaism rejects all of those. They say that was a mistake. It's not, and when I say Haredi, it's not just one group. It's a label for a number of subgroups. But they tend to all have Eastern European roots. Today, the Haredim are primarily located in Israel and the United States, particularly New York and New Jersey. Their population is growing rapidly due to high birth rate. It doubles every 15 years. They are busy, but there are many rules of how to be busy. I try the best I can not to make of fundamentalists an other. So I shouldn't laugh. It's estimated there were approximately 1.5 million Haredi Jews in the world in 2020 and growing rapidly. It's gained growing media interest over the issue of gender segregation. Gender segregation, both in Israel and New York, and I'll return to this issue in a moment. The formation of the Haredi is attributed to this gentleman, this rabbi, late 18th century Rabbi Moses Sofar, who opposed the calls by some liberal Jews to seek acceptance by the non-Jewish world, as seen in the modification of those religious practices deemed inconsistent. So the liberals wanted to get rid of certain practices that didn't fit into what they considered modern European life. They didn't want to throw out the Torah. They didn't want to throw out their tradition, but they just thought a lot of these rules needed to be discarded. Rabbi Sofar, on the other hand, went by this slogan: New, N-E-W, is forbidden by the Torah. You see that backwards looking. Announcing his opposition to any philosophical, social, or practical change to orthodox practice. It's that argument. Once you change one thing, then you'll change the next, then you'll change the next, and before you know it, there will be no Judaism. As just mentioned, the basic belief in general is that the group represents the latest link in the chain of Jewish continuity extending all the way back to the golden age of Judaism. In this regard, they believe that there are two distinct guides to Jewish law, which were given to the Israelites. The first is the written law, which is the Torah, given to Moses, as Jews know it today. The second, and I think Rabbi Elbert, why not? Reverend Elbert has spoken about this, is the oral law, of which the Pharisees were very much involved in. And this is a later explanation of the written law. If you have any law, you're going to have explanations written later, right? My father-in-law, who's now passed, used to say, Moses came down from the mountain with 10 commandments. Then the lawyers got a hold of it. Okay, so this is this idea. So law has to be expanded, because if you just say, thou shalt not do this, well, what about this circumstance? What about this circumstance? What about that circumstance? And that what oral law was meant to expand it. And this was given to the authoritative religious leaders or rabbis of each generation, and the Haredi interpretation of oral law is the authoritative one. The Haredi rabbis had the authoritative reading of the written law. Thus, the law, which is known as halacha, is considered a set of God-given instructions to effect spiritual and moral perfection. Perfection. And as such, it cannot be deviated from, even slightly. And those who have deviated are lost souls who become afflicted by a sense of spiritual emptiness. And if this applies even to Jews, well, I'm sorry about you guys. Halacha includes codes of behavior applicable to as many hypothetical situations as you can imagine. And these have developed over time and are constantly recorded. So if you want to know a friend of mine's sister, who was ultra-Orthodox and was visiting, whether she could buy those kosher M&Ms. There are kosher M&Ms. She had to call the rabbi to get permission.
What did he say?
He said, yeah, they're good.
Just bring me some.
So that's it. What's important here. That leadership, the local rabbi, will determine just about everything about your behavior. So lives of the Haredim revolve around the careful fulfillment of literally thousands of rules. Thousands of rules. And very ritualistic, definite rituals that have to be followed the exact way. No deviation from the traditional ritual path. Do you see the notion? Deviation, change, takes you away from purity, from tradition, from what is valued. So generally, these people have been non-political. But in more recent decades, they've come into conflict with secular law. And they've established their own community, so they have their own ghettos, as it were. And within those ghettos, they then want to establish their own legal codes. Now, they have to adapt to the American legal system. But within their communities, they have other codes which prevail. They've recently been seen both in Israel and in New York and New Jersey to be out on the streets protesting such things as the hours of movie theaters. They should only be able to be shown at certain hours. The location of public swimming pools. There is to be no public swimming pool in our neighborhood. Why? Well, people usually don't swim in full attire. Yes. And some of them may be there. Yep. And this might be to some degree valid, because I agree with it to some of it. The over-sexual content of advertisements. We can agree with that. In this regard, a number of years ago, there were clashes between the Haredim and police in Israel over the issue of segregation of women. The violence began west of Jerusalem, and it came after a wave of incidents elsewhere in Israel in which women had been compelled, now this will sound familiar, to sit at the back of the bus. Any buses serving in ultra-Orthodox areas, or get off. This despite court rulings that women may sit where they please. Here we have an interesting conflict between religion and state. Now, they were saying this is just in our community. We're not trying to say this has to be everywhere. But the state usually doesn't say, well, okay, you can have your law here and our law and civil law out here. So there's been conflict. And as you can see, demonstrations, arrests, etc. Signs posted in ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods instructed women to dress modestly in long sleeves and calf-length skirts. Women's rights activists say that the ultra-Orthodox have become increasingly radical over gender segregation and are winning concessions in their communities that harm women. What the law has tended to do is back off. As long as you keep it, but that's not how the law is supposed to work. The law is supposed to be for everyone. You can't have segregation of women in one, but they've tended to back off. Here's a protest sign. Yeah. Did you want to read that? build a modern wall. What's the wall?
The wall.
What's the wall in Judaism? The wall. The Wailing Wall. The wall that, against the Temple Mount, where Jews go to pray from all over the world. They don't want women there. Traditionally, women were not allowed. If you go today, there's a men's wall, and over here a small section for women. The Haredi say that is what? That's a compromise. Women should not be allowed at the wall, and that's what that protests. So one of their protests, as the women were at the wall, they had a number of their group go and throw eggs at them and drive them out. Spitting and throwing stones at young girls for being dressed immodestly. Now, what's interesting about this group is that traditionally they've been anti-Zionist. What is Zionism? Zionism was and is a movement that espouses the establishment of and support for a homeland for the Jewish people centered in Israel. It began in Europe in the 18th, 19th centuries, Jews wanting to go back to Israel and establish a home initially and eventually a Jewish state. It gained support from the British government after the defeat of the Ottomans. The Ottoman Turkish Empire had controlled Palestine for centuries. When they lost the war, the Brits, the Poms, I can say that because I have British ancestors, took control under what was known as the British Mandate. There was a Jewish homeland. Immigration was valued, and lo and behold, it led to warfare and the eventual establishment of the State of Israel. Shortcut of a lot of history there. This group opposed Zionism, which you might find interesting, right, or surprising. They opposed it for two reasons. First, they look upon Zionists as heretics and unbelievers, demonstrated in their conviction that they could, by their own actions, bring about the redemption of the Jewish people, which is only in the hands of God when He sends the Messiah. They claim that Zionists were trying to shortcut the process. They were going to do politically what could only be done in the Haredi view religiously by the Messiah. One of the main concepts of Judaism across the board still is that the Messiah is still to come. So they said that Zionism was usurping God's role and actually turning the state of Israel into the Messiah. So that's why they were opposed to it. They also opposed the claim that one can be a Jew by being a Zionist. You can only be a pure Jew, according to the Haredi, what? If you're part of that group that follows ultra-Orthodoxy. Otherwise, you're compromising. Okay, so that's one group. Whoops. This is the second group. They're known as the Hardal, Hardal. A name given, again, to a number of groups. That's a sort of an umbrella name for other smaller groups, representing the opposite, extreme religious Zionism. These are the supporters of extreme Zionism. And they're driven by the thought of this rabbi, 1891 to 1982, Rabbi Zvi Yehuda Kook. Don't laugh. He taught that secular Zionists, through their conquests of the land of Israel, had unwittingly brought about the beginning of the final redemption, which would end in the coming of the Messiah. So see what Kook did was say, okay, the Messiah has to come, but secular Zionism has provided the pathway to get there. Although he believed in the Orthodox position about law, or halacha, he did not think it as important as something called emahan, which is rendered in English as faith or belief. More specifically, faith in God's fulfillment of his messianic promise. That's the core belief of these extreme Zionists, the messianic promise. In this context, Zionism is a holy cause because it is obligatory by tradition for all Jews to live in Israel before the Messiah can return. Not only that, they have to have sovereignty over all the land. Those were the conditions set for the return of the Messiah. So it occurs in stages. First, the Jewish people return to the land. Then they must establish sovereignty over the land. There's a little problem here because if you've ever been to Israel, there's not only Jews that live in Israel. There's a large group of people called Palestinians. And for some reason, well, perhaps behind the press, everyone thinks that all Palestinians are Muslim. A large number are Christian. If you've ever been to Nazareth, for example, which is a Palestinian community where there's a major Christian cathedral. So then people, once they've established over the land, then they repent, and then the Messiah will come. So that's the worldview that dominates this group. And this, they developed a community called the Gash Emanim, Block of the Faithful. Remember when I talked about those at the beginning, the chosen people? They're called the Block of the Faithful. That's how they refer to themselves. Whose supporters believe that an active establishment of sovereignty over the land God had allotted them is necessary by building purified Jewish settlements, as outlined in the Bible. You've heard about the issue of Jewish settlements in the West Bank, where Zionist Jews go out, usually in higher levels, with support of the government now, will build settlements based on only Jews living there. And often they sit above the Palestinian communities. So, but this is part of what's religious about this for them is until this happens, the Messiah cannot return. This is how it's expressed in one of their writings. The land of Israel, within its biblical borders, has a lofty internal quality. Every bit of its territory, every clump of earth is the Holy of Holies, as the Torah declares. The holiness is also derived from the nature of redemption. Redemption means sovereignty over the entire promised land. Therefore, any declaration or deed by any government in the world, including that of Israel, which contests hold on the territories liberated in the Holy War, has no validity and is considered null and void. In contrast, all weapons of the army which conquers and defends our land are of spiritual value and are as precious as religious articles. An IDF rifle and tank have the same value as a prayer shawl. Soldiers are as important as Talmudic scholars, and settlers are particularly a saintly group. Our battle cry is, not 1 inch. And our watchword is do or die. They weren't established into a really organization until 1974, but where they started to really develop was during the Six-Day War. Remember, in 1967, which gave Israel control over the West Bank. Then in late 1974, two rabbis attempted to establish a settlement on the ruins of the Sebastia train station, which was a station from the Ottoman period. So they wanted to establish a settlement there. When you establish this, if we establish a settlement, we would take this group, we would go find land, we would get our resources, we would start building houses, we would start building our own community on this land. After 7 attempts and 6 removals by the Israeli Defense Forces, an agreement was finally reached, according to which the Israeli government allowed 25 families to settle at the Kadum army camp southwest of Nablus. Do I have Nablus? Yeah, Nablus is on there. Yeah, you see where Nablus is? Yeah. Okay, so they fought for this. Eventually, the government gives in, just a bit, 25 families. But then this model was subsequently copied in other settlements. Over time, more and more settlements began to grow. And unlike the other group, these guys are very politically active. They do not see politics as a problem. The political solution, remember, is the first step. How are you going to control sovereignty of all that land unless you have political power behind you? And so they gained the support of the Likud party. Anybody recognize that gentleman? Netanyahu. Which between 77 and 84 permitted the launching of numerous Jewish settlements in the West Bank. That's the West Bank. Largely Palestinian. Likud is a right-wing political party founded in 1973. I don't know if any of you can remember these names, by Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon, heroes of the Six-Day War, in an alliance with other right-wing parties. Here's the party platform. The Jewish communities in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza are the realization of Zionist values. Settlement of the land is a clear expression of the unassailable right of the Jewish people to the land of Israel and constitutes an important asset in the defense of the vital interests of the state of Israel. The Likud will continue to strengthen and develop these communities, these settler communities, and will prevent their uprooting. Similarly, they claim the Jordan River as the permanent eastern border to Israel, and also claim Jerusalem to belong to Israel, and this was before it became the capital. Remember, the capital was then switched from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the group has major support within the military. It was during this time, April of '84, that an Israeli broadcast service announced the discovery of a plot to blow up 6 Arab buses during a crowded rush hour in response for buses that had been attacked by Palestinian terrorists. It was found that the Gush Alanim was behind this. Moreover, and if this had happened, God save Israel, there was a plan to blow up the Dome of the Rock, this major Muslim shrine on the Temple Mount, one of the most holy sites in the Islamic world. The plot was uncovered. All members belonged to the Gush Eminim. In 1987, there was something called the Intifada. Do you remember this? This was a Palestinian uprising, violent riots throughout Palestinian territories in Israel. It lasted for 4 years, from 87 to 91, finally ended in what was known as the Madrid Conference. And this event, which was very problematic for Israeli society, you're living under constant fear of attack. It made many secular Jews, and most of Israel, population-wise, is still what we would call secular Jews. There are the ultra-Orthodox, and they're growing. They have a lot of political power, but the majority are still secular Jews, began to reconsider the costs of continuing to support the territories. So this became a major issue within Israeli politics. To maintain these communities, what party supported that? The Likud? Or to back off, try and find some peaceful settlement by the more liberal parties. And thus, today, even there are two main camps. Coalition of fundamentalist messianists, believing in the coming of the Messiah, and their supporters, and a politically and socially heterogeneous group united in opposition. So this is one of the main political questions in Israel. And at this point, if you've followed recent elections in the last years, Likud is very powerful. The settlements continue to increase. So the Gush Eminim eventually broke up into smaller groups as a result of this gentleman. His name is Yigal Amir. He assassinated Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, if you remember Rabin, in 1995. And it found that he was affiliated with extremist groups or extremist factions of this fundamentalist group. The assassination took place November 4th, 1995. Because why? What had Rabin done? He had signed what were known as the Oslo Accords, which were an attempt to bring about reconciliation to some degree between the Palestinians and the Israeli government. The extreme saw him as the ultimate enemy. When someone becomes your ultimate enemy, this is often a justification for violence, and in this case, it was an assassination. This was just before he was assassinated. He was at a mass rally in Tel Aviv. Many people saw the Oslo Accords, especially secular, moderate Jews, as, okay, here's some hope for peace. Right? So he was at a rally. He walked down the city steps after he was finished towards the open door of his car, at which Amir fired 3 shots at him with a semi-automatic pistol. 2 hit him. He was taken to a nearby hospital where he died on the operating table of blood loss and 2 punctured lungs. So there's examples tonight of Jewish fundamentalism. And what's important is that not all fundamentalist groups agree on everything, but there are common features. There are common features. One of the main features is the fear of modernity, the fear of change, the need to get back to purity, to what is our religion, because it's being polluted. We'll see this not only in fundamentalist Christianity, we'll see it in Islam, especially in some of the right-wing terrorist groups of Islam. You want to go back to the fundamentalist position when everything was great, the time of Muhammad. Hindus want to go back to Hindu Raj. So there's this tendency, and again, I suggest we all have a little bit of this in us. We all have a tendency to want to stabilize. Don't we have? I know I have a lot of nostalgia. You know, I look back. I was a privileged white kid living in Glendale, so I didn't see much of the real world. But I have a lot of nostalgia about that time, when the only really important thing was playing wiffle ball. And the world seemed fun. And it was okay. And I think we all experience that to some degree. So what I would suggest is that fundamentalist groups are just take that to an extreme. And in doing that, they push out everybody else. Okay, so that ends tonight's session. Next week we'll be looking at Protestant Christian fundamentalism. And like I said, that'll be followed in successive weeks by Islam and Hinduism. So thanks for coming. Any questions, comments? No, you don't need to.
What's the issue going on today in Israel with Netanyahu? I heard on television a young man saying that he was not going to support a dictatorship.
Netanyahu wants to, he calls it streamlining the judicial process. He wants to take away some of the power of the judiciary courts and give them to the government. And that's why people think, well, he just wants to be a dictator. Because what dictators tend to do, if you look at any dictatorship, the two elements you need to get rid of if you're going to be successful or get them on your side, the military and the law. So probably the reference was he's got the military, the big support for the Likud in the military. If we can just get rid of the law, or not get rid of the law, but massage the law so that, and the way you do that is you have to do some institutional change. So they've been proposing, and there was big protests throughout Israel from mainstream Jews against it, but that was the notion. We want to change the law, or the way the law works, to favor our position. We do that here as well. Okay, and both sides have done it historically. We call it the Supreme Court. The presidents appoint people to the court who tend to agree with their positions. And it's both sides have done it. So it's not a one-side issue. And of course, one of the problems is, there's no term limit. Okay, thanks again.